Did you ever stop and think about how many kitchen items from the 1970s were so absurdly designed that they are now banned? These funny-looking gadgets shaped daily routines so completely that no one imagined they could be dangerous. So what hidden hazards were lurking inside every 70s kitchen drawer? Lawn jar-shaped corn holders with lead tips were one of those oddly aggressive kitchen tools that felt perfectly normal in the 1970s. These tiny, pointed skewers were jabbed into both ends of a steaming ear of corn so you could eat without burning your fingers. Kids loved them because they looked like tiny weapons, and parents loved them because they kept greasy hands off the dinner table. What nobody questioned was what those sharp tips were actually made of. Many holders used lead-based metals, giving them that satisfying weight and polished gleam that felt sturdy and reliable. Families stuck them into food that went straight into mouths, sometimes dozens of times per summer, without a thought about what might transfer from metal to tongue. Children chewed on them between bites, toddlers waved them around, and nobody wondered if the material was safe. Once researchers connected lead exposure to serious health effects, these cheerful utensils were pulled from shelves and banned. It is strange how something so small and silly could carry a risk that serious, hiding in plain sight at every backyard barbecue. Egg slicers with exposed piano wire blades were the kind of kitchen tool that looked like a tiny medieval torture device disguised as a breakfast accessory. The hinged frame held a row of razor-sharp wires stretched so tightly they hummed when you flicked them, and all you had to do was place a boiled egg on the base and press down for perfect slices. Kids were fascinated and could not resist running their fingers across the wires, discovering the hard way that those strings cut deeper than they looked. Parents shrugged off the occasional nick because the tool was simply too convenient to abandon. Every kitchen drawer in the 1970s seemed to have one rattling around beside the bottle opener. The problem was that the wires were completely unguarded, and when the slicer was pulled from a crowded drawer or handed to a child, fingers met blade before anyone could react. Emergency rooms documented enough injuries to catch the attention of regulators, and the most dangerous models were banned and redesigned with protective frames. Looking back, it feels absurd that a tool meant for something as gentle as a boiled egg could leave so many people reaching for bandages instead of toast. Hand crank ice crushers with open gears were the kind of contraption that looked like they belonged in a factory rather than on a kitchen counter. These heavy metal machines had exposed gears that ground ice into shards with a satisfying crunch, and families used them for cocktails, snow cones, and summer drinks without ever guarding the moving parts. The crank handle spun freely, and the gears meshed with enough force to crush anything that slipped between them, including curious fingers. Kids loved turning the handle because it made them feel powerful, like they were operating real machinery, and parents rarely stopped them because fresh crushed ice outweighed any worry. Hair, sleeves, and jewelry all found their way into the gears, and the injuries ranged from painful pinches to far worse. The machine sat proudly on counters during parties, completely unshielded, humming with the mechanical charm the 1970s celebrated. Once modern appliance safety standards caught up with common sense, these crushers were banned for household use. It is almost comical to picture a kitchen tool with exposed industrial gears sitting next to the toaster, but that was how things worked. Fondue, sets with unshielded open flame burners, were the crown jewel of every 1970s dinner party, sitting at the center of the table like a bubbling cauldron of social sophistication. The setup was simple and terrifying in equal measure. A pot of boiling cheese balanced on a thin metal stand, heated by a canister of fuel that burned with an open flame inches from napkins and wandering hands. Everyone gathered around with long forks, dipping bread and fruit into the molten mixture while the flame flickered close to anything flammable. Kids reached across with skewers that dripped hot cheese onto tablecloths and bare arms. Spills were common, burns were shrugged off, and the occasional flare-up when fuel was refilled mid-party was treated as entertainment rather than emergency. Nobody considered that an open flame surrounded by overexcited children was a recipe for disaster. Today, unshielded open-flame tabletop burners are banned under fire safety codes, and fondue sets use electric heating elements instead. But the memory of that wobbly flame lighting up a crowded dinner table still flickers warmly for anyone who survived the era unscathed. Ceramic crockpots glazed with lead-based paint were some of the most trusted kitchen companions in the 1970s, simmering stews, soups, and casseroles for hours while families went about their day. The pots came in gorgeous, earthy tones: harvest gold, avocado green, and burnt orange, colors so perfectly 70s they practically came with a shag carpet warranty. People loved how the thick ceramic held heat evenly and made every meal taste like it had been cooking since morning. What nobody realized was that the beautiful glazes contained lead, and as the crockpot heated for hours, that lead slowly leached into the food inside. Families served these meals to children and guests without concern because the pot looked wholesome and harmless. The longer the food cooked, the more lead seeped in, turning a convenience into a quiet contamination source on the counter. When health studies connected lead-glazed cookware to dangerous exposure levels, regulators banned the formulas and forced manufacturers to reformulate. It is unsettling to think that the crockpot that made your grandmother's famous chili carried a risk nobody tasted or suspected until science intervened decades later. Pressure cookers without safety release valves were the ticking time bombs of the 1970s kitchen, and somehow every family treated them like perfectly normal appliances. These heavy-lidded pots sealed shut with a clamp that locked in steam until pressure built high enough to cook dried beans in minutes. The problem was breathtakingly simple. If pressure climbed too high with no valve to release it, the lid could launch off the pot like a metal disc aimed at the ceiling. Kitchens across the country experienced explosions that sent boiling food, steam, and shrapnel in every direction, burning anyone standing nearby. Parents told stories about the time the cooker blew as if it were a funny anecdote, then put the lid back on and used it again the following week. Kids learned to leave the room when the pot started hissing, not because anyone explained the danger, but because the sound alone was terrifying enough to drive them out. When regulators demanded mandatory safety valves, the old models were banned from sale. Today, modern pressure cookers have multiple fail-safes, but the memory of those rattling, hissing pots still makes people flinch. Aluminum ice trays treated with cadmium plating looked sleek and modern inside every 1970s freezer, their shiny finish reflecting the light like tiny mirrors waiting to be cracked open. People loved them because they froze water quickly, popped out cubes cleanly, and felt sturdier than the flimsy plastic trays on store shelves. The satisfying pull of the metal lever that loosened the cubes was a kitchen ritual, and kids fought over who got to do it because the cracking sound felt rewarding. What nobody knew was that the smooth coating came from cadmium, a heavy metal that slowly flaked off with each freeze and thaw cycle. Those flakes mixed into the ice, dissolved into drinks, and ended up in the glasses of everyone in the family. Children drank lemonade, adults sipped cocktails, and holiday punch bowls sparkled with cubes carrying invisible contamination. Researchers discovered that cadmium damaged kidneys, weakened bones, and accumulated in the body over time. When the bans arrived, families were stunned that their trusty trays had been quietly poisoning them with every perfectly popped cube. It feels surreal knowing that frozen water once carried a danger nobody imagined. Plastic pitcher sets made with BPA-laced resin were a colorful staple in every 1970s kitchen, lined up on refrigerator shelves like a rainbow of refreshment waiting to be poured. These pitchers came in cheerful shades of orange, yellow, and green, matching the era's love of bold kitchen decor, and families used them daily for juice, iced tea, and lemonade. Kids grabbed them from the fridge, pouring glasses with a confidence that came from knowing these pitchers were practically unbreakable. Parents loved them because they survived drops, dishwashers, and household chaos without cracking. What nobody understood was that the hard plastic contained bisphenol A, a chemical that leached into liquids, especially when the pitcher sat in sunlight or was washed in hot water. Every cold drink poured from those containers carried traces of a compound later linked to hormonal disruption. Children were the most vulnerable, drinking from these pitchers multiple times daily without anyone suspecting a thing. When regulators issued bans on BPA in food containers, Families were shocked to learn their most trusted kitchen staple had been quietly compromising the drinks they served with such care. Asbestos trivets and hot pads were once the ultimate kitchen safety item, proudly sold as the toughest, most heat-proof protection money could buy for countertops and tables. In the 1970s, every well-equipped kitchen had at least one thick pad made with asbestos fibers sitting beside the stove, ready to cradle scorching pots without flinching. People trusted them because they did exactly what they promised, absorbing heat without burning, melting, or catching fire. Grandmothers passed them down like heirlooms, and hardware stores displayed them alongside oven mitts and dish towels. What nobody realized was that every time these pads were squeezed, folded, or worn down by use, they released microscopic asbestos fibers into the kitchen air. Those invisible particles drifted into lungs while families cooked dinner, settled onto plates, and lingered long after the dishes were washed. By the time scientists uncovered the devastating health effects of asbestos exposure, these pads had spent years silently contaminating the rooms where families gathered most. The bans came swiftly, and households everywhere threw out items they had trusted for decades. Electric can openers without blade guards were the futuristic kitchen gadgets that every 1970s household proudly displayed on the countertop, right next to the coffee percolator and the avocado green blender. The idea was thrilling. Press a lever, watch the can spin, and let the machine do all the work while you stood back feeling like you had stepped into the future of food preparation. Kids were mesmerized by the spinning motion and the sharp whirring sound, which naturally made them want to get as close as possible to the blade. The problem was that early models had exposed cutting wheels that kept spinning even after the can was removed, and fingers that reached in too quickly met a blade still hungry for something to slice. Emergency rooms documented a steady stream of deep cuts and injuries, serious enough to require stitches. Parents handed these machines to children as kitchen lessons, never imagining the blade could cause real damage. Once regulators demanded blade guards and automatic stop mechanisms, the old models were recalled and banned. It is almost laughable to imagine a kitchen appliance with an exposed spinning blade beside the sugar bowl, but nobody questioned it then. Teflon-coated cookware with unregulated PFOA chemicals was the pride of every 1970s kitchen, a miracle surface that promised eggs would slide off and cleanup would take seconds. Families cooked on these non-stick surfaces daily, marveling at how nothing stuck and everything looked effortless. Parents stacked these pans beside the stove without concern about what made the coating possible. What nobody understood was that when these pans overheated, the coating broke down and released toxic fumes into the kitchen air. Families inhaled those vapors while standing over sizzling skillets, never connecting headaches or nausea to the pan beneath their eggs. Pet birds in nearby rooms sometimes collapsed from the fumes, a grim clue that went unnoticed for years. Once researchers identified PFOA as a persistent chemical linked to serious health concerns, regulators moved to ban the compound from cookware. Manufacturers scrambled to reformulate, and families tossed out pans they had relied on for years. It is unsettling to realize that the most convenient tool in the kitchen was quietly filling the air with something nobody should have been breathing. Mercury bulb meat thermometers were a trusted kitchen companion in the 1970s, jabbed into roasts, turkeys, and casseroles with the confidence of a tradition that had survived generations. The thin glass tube filled with silvery mercury gave readings that felt precise and scientific, making even amateur cooks feel like professionals monitoring their holiday bird. People loved the satisfying way the mercury crept up the scale, marking the exact moment dinner was ready. But glass is fragile, and kitchens are rough places. All it took was one bump, one drop, or one enthusiastic child helping with the turkey for the thermometer to snap inside the food. Mercury spilled into the meat, pooling in crevices nobody could see, mixing with juices later spooned over plates. Families carved and served those meals without realizing they had introduced a toxic heavy metal into dinner. Once health authorities connected mercury exposure to neurological and organ damage, these thermometers were banned from kitchen use. Today, digital thermometers do the job safely, but the image of a cracked glass tube leaking silver into a golden roast haunts anyone who remembers them. Copper cookware lined with uncoated tin was considered the finest kitchen equipment money could buy in the 1970s, hanging from pot racks like gleaming trophies of culinary ambition. The copper conducted heat beautifully, and the thin tin lining was supposed to keep food from touching the reactive metal beneath. Cooks loved the even heating, the gorgeous appearance, and the feeling of using something truly professional. But tin is soft, and it wore away with every stir, every scrub, and every acidic sauce that bubbled inside. Once the lining vanished, food sat directly against raw copper, which leached into tomato sauces, wine reductions, and anything with citrus. People experienced nausea, stomach cramps, and metallic tastes they blamed on seasoning rather than cookware. The problem worsened as families used the same pots for years without realizing the protective barrier had long since worn through. When researchers confirmed copper ingestion caused real harm, regulators banned cookware without proper barrier coatings. Those beautiful copper pots now hang as decoration, a reminder that elegance in the kitchen sometimes came with a hidden price. Spring-loaded potato ricers with no finger guards were the kind of kitchen tool that required the grip strength of a lumberjack and the trust of someone who had never been betrayed by a spring mechanism. In the 1970s, these heavy metal devices were the preferred method for smooth mashed potatoes, and families used them at every holiday dinner. You loaded the cooked potato into the chamber, squeezed the handles together, and watched the potato extrude through tiny holes like edible confetti. The problem was the spring. When handles were released, the spring snapped back with startling force, and anyone whose fingers were in the wrong place learned a painful lesson about kitchen physics. Children who tried helping often got their small hands caught between the handles, resulting in pinched skin, smashed fingers, and tears rivaling the peeling of onions. Adults developed bruises and blisters from repeated holiday use. Once enough injuries were documented, regulators demanded finger guards and redesigned mechanisms. Today, potato ricers come with safety features that seem obvious, but in the 70s, the only protection was experience and a healthy respect for the snap. Gas stoves without automatic shutoff valves were the workhorses of the 1970s kitchen, burning steadily from morning coffee to evening pot roast without a single modern safety feature. The pilot light, a tiny blue flame burning constantly beneath the stovetop, was supposed to ignite the burners whenever you turned the dial. But pilot lights blew out regularly, sometimes from a breeze through an open window, sometimes from a pot boiling over, and sometimes for no reason at all. When that flame went out, raw gas continued flowing quietly into the kitchen, filling the room with an invisible cloud that could ignite from the smallest spark. Families cooked, ate, and sat in kitchens saturated with fumes without realizing the danger until a match was struck or a light switch flipped. Some households smelled the additive and opened windows, but many grew so accustomed to faint gas odors that they stopped noticing entirely. When regulators required automatic shutoff valves that cut the supply when no flame was detected, the old stoves were banned. It is chilling to think how many families stood in kitchens filled with invisible fuel, trusting a tiny flame to keep them safe from explosion. Painted wooden cutting boards with lead-based finishes were one of those charming kitchen decorations that doubled as a working surface in the 1970s. Families hung them on walls when not in use, admiring the hand-painted fruit designs, rooster motifs, and cheerful country scenes that made every kitchen feel warm and inviting. When it was time to chop vegetables or slice bread, the board came down from its hook and went straight to work. Nobody thought about what was in the paint because decorative finishes were simply part of how things were made, but lead-based paint chips and flakes off over time, especially when a knife blade drags across the surface repeatedly. Those tiny particles mixed into food, settled onto countertops, and transferred to hands that later touched mouths without washing. Children were especially at risk because their developing bodies absorbed lead far more readily than adults. When testing revealed dangerous contamination on these boards, regulators banned lead-based finishes on any surface that contacted food. The cheerful artwork that once brightened kitchen walls suddenly became a symbol of how easily danger hid behind the prettiest designs. Rotary cheese graters with exposed drum blades were the kind of kitchen gadget that turned a simple block of cheddar into a snowfall of shredded cheese and occasionally a sprinkle of shredded knuckle. In the 1970s, these hand-cranked contraptions sat in kitchen drawers like tiny engines of destruction disguised as mealtime helpers. You pressed a block of cheese against a spinning metal drum covered in sharp teeth, turned the handle, and watched the shreds tumble out the other side. The thrill of watching cheese fly from the grater made kids beg to help, but the spinning drum had no housing or guard to stop fingers from following the cheese straight into the blade. One slip, one distraction, and the sharp metal teeth bit into skin before anyone could pull back. Adults lost patches of knuckle skin so regularly that bandaged fingers at dinner became an unspoken badge of cooking effort. When injury reports reached a critical mass, regulators required safety housings that enclosed the drum. Today, rotary graters keep fingers safely away from the blade, but anyone who used the old ones remembers the specific sting of cheddar seasoned with a hint of personal sacrifice. Ungrounded electric kettles with metal bodies were a morning staple in the 1970s, heating water for coffee, tea, and oatmeal with the hum of an appliance nobody questioned. These kettles were built entirely from metal, giving them a satisfying weight and sturdy appearance that suggested they could outlast the house. People filled them at the sink, plugged them in with wet hands, and stood waiting for the whistle without a thought about electrical safety. The problem was that without a grounding wire, any fault in the heating element sent live current straight through the metal body. A person touching the kettle with damp hands completed the circuit, and the shock traveled through their body before they could pull away. Some jolts were minor and startling, but others were severe enough to cause real injury. Families used these kettles for years, blaming occasional tingles on static rather than a design flaw. When regulators required grounding protection on all metal appliances, the old kettles were banned from sale. It is unsettling to think that the simple act of making morning tea once carried a risk that could genuinely stop your heart. Ceramic dinnerware sets with uranium oxide glazes were some of the most striking dishes in the 1970s kitchen, their brilliant orange and red hues glowing with a warmth that made every meal feel festive. These plates and bowls were treasured for vibrant colors that came from uranium compounds mixed into the glaze. Families ate off these dishes daily, piling them with hot food that sat directly against a surface containing low levels of radioactive material. Nobody suspected that the color came from a substance associated with nuclear energy, because the dishes looked harmless and were sold everywhere without restriction. Children ate cereal from these bowls every morning, adults served dinners on these plates, and the dishes were washed and reused thousands of times. When radiation testing revealed that these glazes emitted measurable radioactivity, the discovery sent shockwaves through households. Regulators banned uranium oxide in consumer ceramics, and families packed away dishes they once displayed proudly. It is almost surreal to imagine eating breakfast off a plate that registered on a Geiger counter, but for millions of families that was simply Tuesday morning. Plastic food storage containers with formaldehyde resin were the organizational heroes of the 1970s kitchen, stacked neatly in cabinets holding everything from leftover casserole to sliced fruit. These rigid containers came in practical shapes with snap-tight lids that promised to keep food fresh for days. Families trusted them because they seemed modern, clean, and more practical than wrapping plates in foil. What nobody understood was that the formaldehyde resin used for stiffness slowly released fumes into the food stored inside. The warmer the food, the faster the release, meaning leftovers reheated in these containers absorbed the highest concentrations. Families packed school lunches, stored holiday leftovers, and stacked them in warm kitchens where chemical release accelerated silently. Children ate food that had been sitting in contaminated containers for hours without anyone realizing the risk. When health researchers linked formaldehyde exposure to respiratory issues, regulators banned the compound in food contact materials. Families replaced entire collections, stunned that something so practical had been quietly contaminating the meals they worked so hard to preserve. Wall-mounted can crushers with exposed lever mechanisms were the kind of rugged kitchen accessory that made every 1970s garage feel like a recycling fortress. These heavy iron devices bolted to the wall, and families used them to flatten aluminum cans with a single powerful pull of the lever. Kids loved operating them because the crunch of collapsing metal made them feel like they were controlling a serious machine. The problem was that the lever had no guard and no mechanism to prevent fingers from getting caught in the crushing zone. When the handle was pulled hard, anything between the plate and the can was flattened along with the aluminum. Children who held the can while pulling the lever learned an agonizing lesson about the physics of force and small fingers. Adults developed bruised palms from repeated use, especially when the lever slipped mid-crush. Once enough injuries were reported, consumer safety rules demanded redesigned models with finger guards and spring returns. The old crushers were banned, replaced by safer versions that crunch cans without threatening the hands feeding them. Hand-cranked meat grinders with open feed tubes were a fixture in the 1970s kitchen, clamped to the edge of the counter like a small iron beast ready to devour whatever was pushed into its gaping metal funnel. Families used these grinders for ground beef, sausage, and holiday meatloaf, and the process was as mesmerizing as it was unsettling. You fed chunks of meat into the wide-open tube, turned the crank, and watched ribbons of ground meat curl out the other end. Kids begged to help because the turning motion felt powerful, and the result looked magical. But that open tube had no guard and no mechanism to stop fingers from following the meat straight into the grinding screw. One distracted moment, one slip of a greasy hand, and the auger pulled flesh just as eagerly as it pulled beef. Emergency rooms documented a disturbing pattern of crushed fingertips and deep lacerations from these machines. When safety data mounted, regulators required feed tube guards and pusher tools that kept hands away from the mechanism. The old open tube models were banned, ending an era when making dinner required genuine bravery. Decorative kitchen canisters with lead-soldered seams were the charming organizational staples of every 1970s kitchen counter, lined up in matching sets holding flour, sugar, coffee, and tea. These tin canisters came in cheerful patterns, and families opened them dozens of times each week. The lids fit snugly, the metal felt sturdy, and the set made any kitchen feel tidy. What nobody realized was that the seams were sealed with lead solder, and every time dry goods shifted against the walls, traces of lead transferred into the food. Flour absorbed it, sugar carried it, and coffee grounds sat in it for days between uses. Families baked with contaminated flour, sweetened drinks with tainted sugar, and brewed morning coffee carrying invisible traces of a toxic heavy metal. When contamination studies revealed the extent of lead migration from soldered seams, regulators banned lead solder in any container designed for food contact. Those pretty canisters were emptied and replaced with safer alternatives. It is unsettling to realize that the tidiest corner of the kitchen was quietly the most dangerous. Countertop deep fryers without thermostat controls were the daring kitchen gadgets that turned every 1970s household into an amateur restaurant with none of the safety equipment. These open vats of boiling oil sat on countertops with nothing more than a plug and a prayer keeping temperatures in check. Families fried chicken, donuts, and French fries, often leaving the fryer unattended while they stepped away to set the table. Without a thermostat, the oil kept climbing past safe temperatures until it reached the smoke point and sometimes the flash point. Grease fires erupted without warning, sending flames toward cabinets and curtains while panicked cooks reached for the wrong thing to douse them. Children stood nearby watching the bubbling oil with fascination, unaware that a single splatter could cause severe burns. When fire departments traced enough kitchen blazes back to these fryers, safety standards were imposed, requiring thermostats and automatic shutoffs. The old models were banned, but the memory of an open vat of boiling oil sitting inches from the counter edge still makes people nervous. Melamine dishware marketed as microwave safe was one of the most cheerful lies the 1970s kitchen ever told. These lightweight, colorful plates looked practically indestructible, surviving drops and dishwashers without a chip or crack. Parents loved them because they bounced instead of shattered, and the bright colors made plain meals look festive. Manufacturers marketed them as safe for everything, including the exciting new microwaves transforming how families heated food. But melamine resin was never designed for microwave radiation. When heated, The material broke down and released formaldehyde and other compounds directly into food. Families reheated leftovers, warmed baby food, and microwaved snacks on these dishes thousands of times without suspecting a thing. Children were the most frequent users, eating off plates that quietly contaminated every warm meal placed on their surface. When safety testing revealed the chemical migration, regulators banned melamine from microwave use. Families who trusted these plates were stunned that convenience had come with an invisible cost hiding beneath every colorful surface. Pull-down recipe holders were a clever invention that now feels like relics. Mounted under cabinets, they had little plastic arms that clipped onto recipe cards. Moms flipped through handwritten index cards, clipped one in place, and followed along while cooking. It kept the card out of spills and splatters, safe from the mess of flour and grease. The design was practical, even ingenious. Many kids remember standing on tiptoe to watch mom clip in a card, squinting at the neat handwriting while the smell of dinner filled the kitchen. Sometimes the holders squeaked as they swung down, adding to the chorus of clattering pots and sizzling pans. Neighbors swapped recipes at church or school, and those cards often ended up clipped under the holder for a week straight. The little arms were surprisingly strong, gripping everything from grease-stained cards to pages torn out of magazines. It was a tiny touch that made the kitchen feel more personal, more lived in. But with cookbooks, magazines, and eventually digital recipes, the pull-down holder faded away. Still, for those who remember, it was an oddly comforting sight, a small helper that made cooking feel organized in a chaotic kitchen. Plastic baby bottle warmers containing BPA were marketed as lifesavers for exhausted parents in the 1980s, promising perfectly heated formula without fuss or complicated preparation. New mothers trusted these devices completely, genuinely believing they were providing the best care during late-night feedings and early morning routines when exhaustion clouded every decision. The plastic reservoirs and warming chambers seemed sturdy, practical, and thoughtfully designed with infants in mind. But BPA, a chemical making plastics hard and clear, did not stay locked inside when heat was applied. It leached directly into the formula, mixing invisibly with liquid babies drank during their most vulnerable developmental months. Scientists later discovered BPA mimicked hormones, disrupting development in ways affecting growth, behavior, and cognition. The revelation sent shockwaves through parenting communities, and regulators quickly banned BPA from baby products entirely. Families who used these warmers were left wondering what their children had been exposed to during thousands of innocent feedings. Those convenient devices became cautionary reminders that safety and marketing do not always mean the same thing. Cadmium-colored enamelware brought a burst of sunshine into 1970s kitchens with its vibrant oranges, fiery reds, and cheerful yellows that made even the simplest cooking tasks feel festive. These bright pots and pans looked stunning hanging from pot racks or sitting on stovetops, their glossy surfaces catching the light and adding warmth to every meal. Families used them daily for boiling pasta, simmering sauces, and warming soups, never imagining that the pigments creating those beautiful colors contained cadmium, a heavy metal with serious health consequences. Every time acidic foods like tomatoes touched these surfaces, tiny amounts of cadmium leached into whatever was being cooked. Children ate from bowls filled with contaminated stews, while parents proudly showed off their colorful kitchen collections. Researchers eventually discovered that cadmium exposure could damage kidneys, weaken bones, and accumulate dangerously over time. The bans arrived swiftly once the evidence became clear, forcing families to discard cookware they had treasured for years. Those cheerful orange pots serve as reminders that the brightest things in our kitchens sometimes carried the darkest secrets. You could walk into nearly any refrigerator in a working-class home in the 1970s, open the door, and there it was, stacks of plastic butter tubs filled with leftovers. It was never just butter inside anymore. Mashed potatoes, stews, a bit of soup, or even yesterday's spaghetti. All of it lived inside a container that used to hold margarine. To poor families, it was the most sensible kind of recycling. You scrubbed it out, dried it, and gave it a second life. They never sealed perfectly. which meant more than one fridge carried the faint smell of onion or meatloaf long after the meal was gone. Kids would know the disappointment of grabbing what looked like butter for toast and finding last night's beans instead. Still, these tubs represented survival. They were an answer to expensive glass Tupperware that only better-off families could afford. To the poor, these humble containers stretched every penny in every meal. In a way, they told a story about making do with what you had, even when it was not glamorous. Do you ever wonder if the ingenuity we had then has quietly disappeared from our kitchens today? Metal ice cube trays with levers were a cold, clunky reality before plastic trays. You poured water into the metal compartments, slid the tray into the freezer, and waited. But when it was time to get the cubes out, the real struggle began. You had to pull a metal lever, cracking the cubes free with a loud snap. Sometimes it worked perfectly. Other times the cubes shattered into jagged chunks or stuck fast. Kids often yelped when the lever pinched their fingers, and parents cursed when water spilled everywhere during the refill. The trays were heavy, clumsy, and always freezing to the touch, but they felt sturdy compared to later plastic versions. Families argued over who had the muscle to yank the lever, especially when it jammed tight. Still, every clink of those trays hitting a glass of soda was part of daily life. Even with all the hassle, they gave a sense of permanence, like kitchen tools built to last forever. Kids learned to brace themselves for the sound of the lever echoing across the kitchen. They were awkward, noisy, and often painful on the fingers. But for decades, they were the only way to get ice at home. Asbestos pot holders and trivets were considered ultimate kitchen safety tools in the 1980s, advertised as heat-resistant and practically indestructible. People grabbed hot pans, lifted scorching casserole dishes, and rested boiling pots on these woven pads without any fear. Manufacturers marketed them as modern marvels every family deserved. Parents passed them between generations, never questioning the grayish fibers woven throughout. But asbestos does not stay locked inside its weave forever. With every use, wash, and fold, microscopic fibers broke loose and drifted into the air. Families inhaled them while standing at the stove, while cleaning up after dinner, while reaching for dessert plates still warm from the oven. Those fibers lodged deep in lungs and stayed there, causing damage that sometimes took decades to appear. When scientists connected asbestos exposure to deadly respiratory diseases, regulators banned these products entirely. The pot holders that symbolized kitchen safety became symbols of hidden danger instead. It is chilling to realize something meant to protect from burns was quietly causing harm far worse. Lead-soldered copper cookware held a special place in 1970s kitchens, its gleaming reddish surfaces suggesting professional quality and timeless elegance that lesser pots could never match. Home cooks displayed these pieces proudly, believing they had invested in something that would last generations and make every dish taste better. The craftsmanship was undeniable, but hidden in the seams where copper panels joined together was lead solder that made the connection strong and seamless. Every time acidic ingredients like wine, vinegar, or tomatoes simmered in these beautiful pots, lead leached silently into the food. Families served marinara sauce and countless other dishes contaminated with a heavy metal that accumulated in bones and blood over time. Children absorbed the toxin even faster than adults, their growing bodies storing poison with every meal their parents prepared with such care. When researchers finally connected copper cookware to elevated lead levels in households, the bans followed quickly. Those elegant pots, once symbols of culinary sophistication, became warnings about how beauty and craftsmanship can sometimes mask dangers simmering beneath the surface. Pickle jars were everywhere, and once the pickles were gone, the jar itself lived on. Poor families in the 1970s rarely wasted glass of any kind, and pickle jars were among the most versatile items in the kitchen. They were wide, sturdy, and sealed tightly enough to keep just about anything safe. Soups and beans often ended up in them. Some people used them for dry storage, sugar, rice, or flour when other containers were not available. And in more than a few households, pickle jars ended up holding nails, screws, and bolts in drawers because there was no budget for fancy storage bins. The faint smell of vinegar often lingered, no matter how many times they were scrubbed. What those jars offered was reliability. They stretched the usefulness of what you had already paid for. They filled the gap between what you wanted and what you could actually afford. In poor kitchens, that kind of thinking was the difference between scraping by and having a little extra to lean on. Today, when so much packaging is designed to be thrown away, do you wonder if we lost the quiet genius of those pickle jars? Built-in wall phones with 20-foot cords were the lifeline of the kitchen. Mounted to the wall, they often became the command center of the household. Moms cooked while cradling the receiver on their shoulder, stretching that cord across the room as kids ducked underneath. The cords twisted into impossible knots, dangling and bouncing as conversations went on. Privacy? Forget it. Everyone in the house could hear your call, no matter how far you stretched. Kids turned those cords into jump ropes or played limbo under them while moms scolded them to stay out of the way. Untangling the cord became a chore of its own, and some cords stayed twisted forever, no matter how hard you tried. Still, there was comfort in it. The phone was always there, always ringing, always part of the daily kitchen soundtrack. Today, it seems almost absurd to imagine being tethered to a wall just to talk. But for families of the time, the wall phone, with its endlessly tangled cord, was as much a kitchen fixture as the oven. Cadmium-colored enamelware brightened 1980s kitchens with shades of orange, red, and yellow so vivid they seemed to glow under fluorescent lights and morning sunshine. Families displayed these pots and pans proudly on stovetops and shelves, using them for everything from simmering Sunday soup to boiling weeknight pasta. The colors felt cheerful and modern, a welcome departure from the dull gray and brown metals of earlier decades. Cooks loved how the enamel cleaned easily and resisted stubborn staining, making these pieces everyday favorites for busy families. But cadmium, the heavy metal that created those brilliant hues, did not stay locked inside the enamel coating forever. Acidic foods like tomatoes, citrus, and vinegar slowly pulled cadmium out of the colorful coating and into whatever was simmering inside. Families ate meals laced with a toxin known to damage kidneys, weaken bones, and accumulate in the body over time. When testing revealed how easily cadmium leached from decorative cookware, regulators demanded strict limits that banned the brightest colors from kitchen use. Those eye-catching pots became dangerous antiques, reminders that cheerful colors sometimes carried the greatest hidden risks. Mercury meat thermometers were the trusted companions of every serious home cook in the 1970s, their slender glass tubes and silver liquid columns promising perfectly roasted turkeys and safely cooked roasts. Families inserted them into holiday birds, Sunday hams, and weeknight chickens, watching the mercury rise with the confidence that came from believing science had made cooking foolproof. What nobody considered was what happened when these fragile instruments broke. A simple bump against a pot lid or a careless toss into a sink could shatter the glass and release mercury droplets that scattered across countertops and floors. This toxic metal did not simply wipe away. It pooled in cracks, evaporated slowly into kitchen air, and clung to surfaces in ways that made complete cleanup nearly impossible. Families unknowingly prepared meals in contaminated kitchens for weeks after accidents they barely noticed. When safer alternatives became available and regulators recognized the residential dangers, mercury thermometers were pulled from store shelves. The precision those silver columns promised came with a price nobody realized they were paying. When the peanut butter was gone, the jar did not go in the trash. It went straight to the sink, got a good wash, and turned into a drinking glass. This was the unspoken rule in poor households across the 1970s, and it made perfect sense. Why buy glassware when food companies were already handing it to you for free? Many of these jars were made from thick glass, sturdy enough to last years. Families would line shelves with them, each one slightly different from the next, creating a mismatched set that became the standard for daily life. Kids drank their morning milk from those jars, fathers filled them with iced tea after long shifts, and mothers served up lemonade at family gatherings with them lined neatly on the counter. And if you grew up in that era, you can still remember the feel of that thick glass rim against your lips. These jars carried more than just liquid. They carried the quiet pride of a family refusing to waste anything. They were proof that you could stretch $1, even down to the container that held your food. And maybe that is why so many people smile when they think back to drinking from a peanut butter jar. It was simple, practical, and just a little bit resourceful. What does it say about us now that we throw away what our parents cherished? Harvest Gold ovens were the bold rival of avocado green. If you walked into a kitchen in the 1970s, you were almost guaranteed to find one or the other. Harvest Gold was a warm, mustard yellow shade meant to represent optimism and sunshine. It looked sleek in magazine spreads, glowing beneath overhead lights. But in real life, it was a lot of yellow. Some families even joked that everything they cooked looked like it had been dipped in mustard because of the oven's glow. The color was so strong that it often clashed with other kitchen shades, yet people kept buying it because it felt modern. Families gathered around meals cooked in these ovens, their golden color casting an odd glow on every casserole dish. For many, the shade became tied to the smells of meatloaf, pot roast, and Sunday dinners. It was cheerful, yes, but it aged quickly. Within a decade, Harvest Gold went from trendy to tacky. Yet no one can deny its place in history, a color that defined the kitchens of an entire generation. Formaldehyde-treated wooden cutting boards were sold throughout the 1980s as hygienic alternatives to the older, untreated boards grandparents had used for generations. Manufacturers promised the chemical treatment prevented dangerous bacteria growth, making these boards safer for preparing raw meat, fresh vegetables, and everything families served for dinner. Homeowners bought them believing they were investing in healthier kitchens, trusting the labels that emphasized cleanliness and modern science. But formaldehyde does not simply vanish once it has been applied to wood. It off-gases slowly, releasing invisible fumes that irritate eyes, throats, and lungs with every single slice and chop. People developed headaches, skin rashes, and respiratory problems without ever connecting their symptoms to the cutting board beside the sink. Children helping with meal prep breathed these fumes at levels no one monitored at the time. When researchers linked formaldehyde exposure to serious health risks, including cancer, regulators cracked down on treated household products. Those cutting boards, once symbols of modern hygiene, were suddenly recognized as sources of invisible kitchen contamination. Aluminum pressure cookers without safety valves were the time-saving heroes of busy 1970s households, promising to turn tough cuts of meat into tender masterpieces in a fraction of the usual time. Families gathered around these hissing, steaming pots with a mixture of excitement and anticipation, watching the pressure gauge climb while dinner transformed inside. The problem was that early models had no reliable way to release excess pressure when things went wrong. One moment you had a pot roast cooking peacefully, and the next moment the lid could launch toward the ceiling with enough force to dent plaster or worse. Kitchens across America experienced explosions that sent scalding food and metal fragments flying in every direction, leaving burns and injuries in their wake. Parents who had proudly shown off their modern cooking technology suddenly found themselves explaining to emergency room doctors how dinner ended up embedded in the walls. When safety standards finally caught up, regulators demanded multiple release mechanisms that made the older models illegal to sell. Those unregulated cookers became cautionary tales about speed and convenience coming at the cost of basic protection. Every kitchen cabinet in a poor family's home had its share of mismatched mugs, most of them given away for free at gas stations. They came as part of promotions. Fill up your tank a few times, and you got a mug with the station's logo stamped on the side. For families who could not afford full matching sets of dishware, these mugs were treasures. Bold block letters, clunky handles, and cheesy slogans made them instantly recognizable. But they held coffee just fine, and that was all that mattered. Fathers drank black coffee from them before heading off to work. Mothers sipped instant coffee while keeping an eye on the stove, and kids often ended up using the same mugs for hot cocoa on cold winter nights. Over time, these mugs chipped, cracked, and faded, yet they stuck around. In a way, they became family artifacts. What made them special was how they reflected a moment in time. They were more than free mugs. They were proof of how resourcefulness turned marketing gimmicks into daily life tools. They were also a reminder that the poor could not always choose matching or perfect things. Instead, they created comfort and meaning out of whatever they had. Looking back, do you think those chipped mugs held more warmth than the designer sets people buy today? Formica counters with boomerang patterns were the definition of retro cool. Bright laminates covered in swirls and curved shapes turned kitchen counters into works of art. The boomerang design, with its playful arcs and atomic age flair, felt futuristic in the 50s and 60s. It was affordable, easy to clean, and colorful in a way stone or wood never could be. Kitchens in pastel pinks, blues, and greens paired perfectly with the wild counter patterns. Families often bragged about how modern their kitchens looked, even if the counters clashed with everything else in the room. Kids scratched doodles into the surface with forks, and those marks stayed forever, part of the kitchen's history. For kids, it felt like growing up inside a comic book. For parents, it was modern living at its best. Of course, Formica did not last forever. It scratched, burned, and peeled over time. But in its heyday, nothing screamed contemporary kitchen like a boomerang pattern counter gleaming under fluorescent light. Ungrounded electric blenders without safety switches were kitchen workhorses in the 1980s, whirring through smoothies, soups, and sauces with raw mechanical power. Families loved the convenience of dropping ingredients into the glass jar and watching everything transform in seconds. These machines felt sturdy and capable, the kind of appliance lasting years without complaint. But early blenders often had metal housings connected to electrical systems with no grounding protection, meaning a short circuit could send current through anyone touching the machine. Wet counters, damp hands, and splashed liquids made the risk even greater. Some models had no safety switch, meaning blades could spin the moment power connected, regardless of whether the lid was secure. Emergency rooms treated cuts, shocks, and burns linked to these appliances more often than manufacturers admitted. When safety standards finally caught up, grounded plugs and automatic shutoffs became mandatory. Those old blenders became dangerous relics, reminders that the machines families trusted most sometimes carried the greatest risks hiding behind convenience. PVC plastic food containers revolutionized kitchen storage in the 1970s, their lightweight durability and airtight seals making them seem like the perfect solution for leftovers, lunch packing, and pantry organization. Families stacked them in refrigerators, microwaved them without hesitation, and filled them with everything from spaghetti sauce to birthday cake. But PVC plastic contained phthalates, chemical softeners that made the material flexible, but also leached into food over time. Heat accelerated this process dramatically, so every reheated casserole and every warm soup stored in these containers absorbed compounds now known to disrupt hormones. Children carried lunches to school in containers that slowly released chemicals into their sandwiches. Parents warmed baby food in plastic that transferred toxins with every heated spoonful. When researchers finally connected soft plastic containers to health concerns, regulators banned the most dangerous formulations. The containers that once symbolized modern convenience became cautionary reminders that storing food safely required far more than just a tight-fitting lid. If you grew up poor in the 1970s, chances are your kitchen drawer held a stack of dish rags that once had a very different life. They were old towels, worn thin, cut down to size, and put back to work. Nothing went to waste, especially not fabric. Frayed edges, faded colors, and stains told the story of their first life. When they were no longer good enough to dry a person, they were good enough to dry dishes. They were scrubbed against counters, soaked in dishwater, and wrung out until threads started to unravel. Poor families could not afford to buy new dishcloths every few months. When you visited a neighbor's home, you would see the same thing. Stacks of cut-up towels folded neatly in a drawer, waiting to be used. What might seem ragged or second-rate now was, back then, just part of life. Those dish rags were symbols of resilience, proof that families knew how to stretch the usefulness of every item. They held the memory of a different time, when resourcefulness was second nature. Does it surprise you that something as small as a rag could remind people of both hardship and pride? Hideaway bread boxes were once the secret storage of the kitchen. Instead of the wicker baskets or countertop bins we see today, these boxes were cleverly built right into the counters, hidden under a sliding panel or disguised as part of the cabinetry. Moms would pull open the section, and inside were loaves of white sandwich bread, dinner rolls, or maybe a few sweet buns saved from the bakery. The idea was simple. Bread stayed fresher, out of sight, and away from curious hands. But there was also a touch of pride in having such a sleek, modern feature built right into the kitchen. Bread boxes became part of the ritual of mealtime. Kids would wait as Mom reached into the hidden drawer, pulling out slices for sandwiches or toast. Some even had faint, yeasty smells clinging to them, proof that bread was the true staple of the family table. Of course, bread eventually came sealed tighter, baked to last longer, and stored more easily in pantries or freezers. That meant the hideaway box slowly lost its purpose. Today, you almost never see them, but for anyone who grew up with one, the memory of opening that secret compartment for a slice of bread is still fresh. Carbon tetrachloride oven cleaners promised homeowners in the 1980s the power to dissolve baked-on grease without scrubbing, and desperate cooks believed every word. The fumes were sharp and overwhelming, but people assumed that meant the product was working hard on their behalf. Mothers sprayed inside ovens, closed the doors, and waited while chemicals worked, often leaning close to check progress through the small window. But carbon tetrachloride was never meant for enclosed household spaces. The fumes attacked livers, kidneys, and nervous systems with speed that shocked medical researchers. People using these cleaners in poorly ventilated kitchens collapsed before understanding what was happening. Emergency rooms documented cases linked directly to products sold in every grocery store. When regulators finally banned carbon tetrachloride for household use, it came with the weight of tragedies that should never have happened. Those powerful cleaners vanished from shelves, replaced by formulas sacrificing strength for safety. It is haunting to think how many people stood inches from danger while simply trying to clean. Teflon-coated pans with PFOA felt like pure kitchen magic when they first appeared in 1970s homes, promising that eggs would slide effortlessly and cleanup would take seconds instead of endless scrubbing. Families marveled at how nothing stuck to these miracle surfaces, tossing away their old cast iron in favor of something that seemed too good to be true. And in many ways, it was. The chemical compound that made these pans so slick released toxic fumes when the coating overheated, which happened more easily than most cooks realized. Birds in kitchens died suddenly from the invisible gases, and people reported flu-like symptoms after cooking sessions that pushed these pans past their limits. Nobody thought to question why a cooking surface could kill a parakeet nearby, because the convenience was simply too appealing to resist. It took decades before researchers understood how these forever chemicals accumulated in the body and refused to break down. When regulators finally stepped in, the original formulations were banned. But the memory of those early pans lingers uncomfortably for anyone who spent years breathing in fumes they never knew existed. Pull-out cutting boards were another once common feature. Built directly into kitchen cabinetry, these wooden slabs slid out like drawers. They saved counter space and provided a dedicated spot for chopping vegetables or slicing bread. But they came with problems. They absorbed smells, warped with moisture, and stained permanently with every onion or tomato. Some boards became so seasoned with marks and stains that they told a family's entire cooking history. Kids rolled out cookie dough on them, pounding cookie cutters until the wood was scarred with little circles. Dads used them for carving roasts, leaving behind knife grooves and grease stains. The boards often squeaked when pulled out, a familiar sound in every household. Even though they were flawed, they gave kitchens a sense of resourcefulness and tradition. Yet, for families with small kitchens, they were a lifesaver. Kids often remembered rolling out cookie dough on those boards, flour dusting the wood as holiday baking took over the room. Today, the pull-out cutting board has all but vanished, but its memory remains in kitchens that valued function above all else. Lead-glazed ceramic mixing bowls were colorful staples of 1980s kitchens, sitting on counters with patterns ranging from cheerful florals to bold geometric designs that seemed perfectly modern. People loved the solid weight of them, how sturdy and reliable they felt during holiday baking marathons or ordinary weeknight meal prep after long days. Mothers mixed cookie dough, whisked salad dressings, and stored leftovers in these bowls without ever questioning what lurked beneath the shiny decorative surface. But the glazes that made these bowls so beautiful often contained lead, and acidic foods like tomato sauce slowly pulled that lead directly into the meal. Families consumed trace amounts with every serving, completely unaware that something so ordinary could be quietly dangerous. Children absorbed lead quickly, and effects on developing brains were severe and sometimes permanent. When testing revealed widespread contamination, regulators demanded changes that pulled the worst offenders from store shelves entirely. Today, those cheerful bowls are collector's items, admired but never used for food again. It is haunting to realize how many batches of holiday cookies carried more than sugar into growing bodies. Unshielded microwave ovens were the technological marvels that every 1970s household wanted to own, promising to revolutionize cooking with invisible waves that heated food in minutes instead of hours. Families gathered around these humming metal boxes with a mixture of awe and curiosity, watching through small windows as leftovers spun on turntables. But early models were rushed to market before anyone fully understood how to contain the energy pulsing inside them. Doors sealed poorly, shielding was inconsistent, and radiation leaked through gaps that manufacturers had not yet learned to prevent. People stood inches away, faces pressed close to watch their food rotate, absorbing energy that escaped through faulty seals. Some reported headaches, dizziness, or a strange tingling sensation when standing too close during operation. Pets avoided kitchens where these machines hummed, and houseplants near countertops wilted without explanation. When regulators finally tested the older units, they discovered leakage levels far exceeding what would later be considered safe. The bans and recalls followed quickly, forcing manufacturers to redesign every seal before selling another unit. Bread drawers with roll-top covers were the finishing touch of a vintage kitchen. Built into cabinets, they kept loaves tucked away neatly, shielded from pests and staleness. The roll-top design made opening and closing them oddly satisfying. Families saw them as a mark of a well-equipped modern kitchen. But over time, bread drawers became unnecessary. Moms loved the way they hid clutter, slipping in not just bread but crackers, cookies, and even lunchbox snacks. Kids loved sliding the cover up and down just for the sound, pretending it was a secret hiding place. Some drawers got stuffed so full that the roll top barely closed, creaking under the pressure of too many loaves. Over time, the covers warped, and crumbs always seemed to collect in the corners no matter how often they were cleaned. Still, they gave kitchens a sense of order, a place where even bread had its own home. Packaged bread lasted longer, freezers took over storage, and counter space became more valuable. Today, bread drawers are rare curiosities, a reminder of a time when every kitchen detail was designed with purpose, even if that purpose eventually disappeared. If any of these banned kitchen gadgets stirred a memory, share your story in the comments, tap like to spread the word, and subscribe so you never miss the history hiding in your kitchen.